Hello, you're watching the TelecomTV Summit on Open Telco Infra and our panel discussion on, appropriately enough, the emergence of open telco infrastructure. I'm Guy Daniels, Director of Content. So how does the telecoms community go about building, developing, supporting and utilising an open telco vendor infrastructure? And perhaps even more importantly, why? What are the benefits? Well, with the help of today's guests, we are going to find out. And joining me on a full programme today are Franz Seiser, VP and Executive Lead for Access Disaggregation at Deutsche Telekom, Paul Miller, Chief Technology Officer for Wind River, Geoff Hollingworth, Chief Marketing Officer at Rakuten Symphony, Beth Cohen, SDN Product Strategies at Verizon, Sandro Tavares, Director Telecom Systems Marketing with Dell Technologies, and John Baldry, Director Metro Marketing at Infinera. Hello everyone, good to see you all. Thanks very much for taking part in our discussion today. This is a real introduction to the topic of open telco infra. So I'd like to first of all ask, can we define open for telco infrastructure? In this context, what do we actually mean when we refer to open infrastructure? Sandro, maybe I could come across to you for your thoughts first.
Absolutely, guys. So yeah, it all starts on the disaggregation of the telecommunication stack, right? So the telecommunication stack for years has been, in some cases, highly proprietary, and the evolution that we're having now towards the disaggregation, the decoupling of hardware and software, and the ability for us to utilize, first of all, commercial off-the-shelf hardware infrastructure with cloud stacks coming from several vendors, and then having cloud-native workloads, in this case, the network functions being integrated on top of the stack, is basically what defines this transformation, right? And the challenge of the industry right now is to make sure that this transformation happens. This disaggregation process happens in the most straightforward way without creating additional costs and without creating operational challenges to the operator. So that's basically what everybody is working at. And so far, I believe that we have been successful in starting to path this road.
Good to hear. Thanks very much, Sandro. And Beth, let me come across to you first, because I know probably most of you want to have a stab at this particular talking point. But Beth, you being in the open community for a while now, you've seen the comings and goings. What's your take?
So not only am I in the open community for a while, but also I obviously represent the telecom perspective. So the open community has been working on this for a while. The open stack originally, which is still, of course, a major player for most of the telecoms today, and I don't foresee that changing. But also, the Linux Foundation networking projects, there's a number of projects out there. But I want to talk a little bit about, sort of the telecom take on it. The telecoms have traditionally done their own infrastructure using vendors such as Dell and Red Hat and other types of vendors like that. And so it's been, I wouldn't call it a partnership, but, we're built on sort of third-party vendor type infrastructure. And increasingly, the telecoms have been moving away from, proprietary stacks and moving toward open stacks. However, they're still using the third-party vendors to sort of intermediate with the open source community and make it all work. And of course, as Sandro mentioned, the disaggregation of the hardware and software is continuing. And I only see that continuing even more, as new networking technologies, SASE, SD-WAN, and other technologies, and the cloud-centric migration continues. So I think open source, infrastructure is a very, very important part of the telecoms infrastructure to support its business operations and, of course, its services.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. It's certainly the way we're going. I'll come to you, John, in a second. But first of all, Paul, let me come across to you because you're seeing a lot of traction within in telcos at the moment. So what do you say open infrastructure actually means?
I think there's a couple of different aspects to it. If you look back through the history here, as Beth mentioned, we first had a transition from a completely proprietary bare metal appliance-based solution that was used for decades in the telco infrastructure to now what we would consider a vertically disaggregated solution where you have hardware and virtualization and applications. That created a new open market, if you will, for the service provider to really have competition throughout the life of the network, where low-cost hardware infrastructure could be continuously competed against during the life of the network. Multiple virtualization players can come into the architecture, and then the application vendors, to their often chagrin, can be swapped out at the push of the button of an orchestrator. And so that fundamentally changed the commercial model and made that more open. So it's not just about technology openness; it's about the commercial model as well. Now, as we've moved forward with things like NFV bringing weight to things like ORAN, the ORAN Alliance and ORAN software community have introduced now what we call an east-west disaggregation, which allows interoperability between the software components within the telco infrastructure, between things like IMS and 5G core and edge systems that can now be brought into the network from different vendors, again, creating incredible flexibility and power for the service provider to control the commercial model. And then in the end, in addition to all of those architectural changes, the openness of truly open source software. At Wind River, we co-founded an initiative with Intel years ago called Starling X. That's what you alluded to a moment ago, Guy, where that pure open source project in the Open Infra Foundation, interestingly, considering the name of today's event, was really founded to solve these distributed cloud challenges that you have in the RAN as we fully virtualize and make that open. Open source is a key part of solving that problem. It allows multiple vendors and the service providers to interact in a common open environment to evolve that technology and solve those challenges. So we think both from an architectural change and transition, commercial model, and then true open source models are required to really embrace the open culture.
Great, thanks very much, Paul. And as you say, it's not just north-south anymore, it's also east-west we're looking at. It's fascinating at the moment. John, let me come across to you because you'd like to add some insights into this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Guy. Yeah, I think I wouldn't disagree with anything that's been said so far. There's a huge shift to open within the whole of the industry, but you quite often find also within specific layers of the network. So I work very much within the optical networking layer, or we do as a company, and the optical networking industry has been on probably a 20-year journey to get to where we are today in terms of openness. It started off with things like standardizing wavelength grids initially to get sort of component costs, standardizing to reduce cost for components. So that's led to many steps along the journey to a point where we're building quite a lot of open networks today, where we're talking about disaggregating at the transport network. So you might be running, in fact, cable networks are a really good example. The wet plant for cables be done by vendor A, and then all the transponders that run over the top come from a range of other vendors. And that part of the industry has been going that way for quite some time. We're seeing a lot of that now happening within transport networks. So we're really sort of disaggregating what would have been a very closed environment, which is just one layer in that stack we've been talking about just now. So it's, there's, once you get down to within the layers, there's a lot of open networking initiatives that are going on that are really around sort of reducing costs, increasing innovation, etc. for users.
Yeah, absolutely, John. There's so many innovations at the moment. Thanks very much for that. Geoff, I'll come to you in a second, but first of all, Franz, open infrastructure, that's got to be pretty much essential to your day job.
Open, that's a bit of a step back. I mean, open, obviously, it's the opposite of closed. And open, if something is open, it's accessible, right? So an open telco infrastructure means it's an accessible infra, and not only on very few points, because that we had always. You always could log on with your devices on the network and use it. And in that sense, it was always open, but also open within the whole system. So as said already, open is very closely linked to disaggregation and to cloudification. it all means all the components are openly accessible, and I have the freedom to put my network together out of components I choose, and I'm not limited to very few players and always compromising because everyone has strengths and weaknesses. But I really can much more like a puzzle put my network together from various pieces. Different players and different operators may have different priorities, so they may take different choices, and that's exactly the power of an open infrastructure to enable that in the end to provide the type of service you want to offer to your customer as an operator.
Thanks very much, Franz. And I think you said the magic word there, freedom. It gives you the freedom. It gives you the choice. Geoff, let's come across to you to round out this this particular question about what does open infrastructure mean to us all.
Yeah, thank you, Guy. And Franz was a good segue in. I'm not going to add very much, but I do want to highlight openness gives the option of choice. But there are two words there that are very important: option and choice. So previously, if you're in a completely closed system, we're in the business of running networks. So you would buy a network in entirety. The alternative of closed is open, where everything's completely open. You're going to buy every small little component and put it all together. The actual value of openness is neither of those two bookends. It's actually applying the right unit of supply to serve your business purpose. So that optionality exists when you have the choice of open components and open interfaces. That doesn't exist if it's completely closed and it's a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah, thanks for those additional points, Geoff, and thanks everyone for your views on that. So we've established what open infrastructure is, but the next obvious question is why bother? What does open infrastructure bring? What are the benefits for telcos, vendors, and of course their customers? Now, we've touched a bit of this earlier, but let's focus down a bit more on the actual benefits that open infrastructure brings. And Paul, let me start by putting that one to you.
Yeah, thanks, Guy. I think that when you start out, obviously, as we spoke a moment ago, there's a commercial paradigm change. There's a landscape where now companies can more rapidly be brought into service provider networks, faster time to market for services for the service provider, an operational model where they're using cloud native and purely software defined principles to manage their entire network, driving TCO down and changing the commercial landscape of the entire network. That's one clear benefit. More subtle, though, and really driving the urgency around virtualizing things like the radio access network is the ability to bring new revenue opportunities into the service provider business. For example, if we look at applications like V2X, a common example I've given is vehicle-to-vehicle accident avoidance or vehicle-to-infrastructure accident avoidance. If you have an automobile following a truck and the driver wishes to take a left turn, the car does the best it can with the LiDAR, radar, and camera information that it has to make that advanced algorithmic decision. However, completing that picture from neighboring vehicles in their immediate vicinity enables that algorithm to truly operate properly. In order to build applications like that, you've got an incredibly real-time system. As these vehicles move around dynamically in the world, you can't afford tens of milliseconds for round-trip delays or even single-digit milliseconds. That really implies that as we go forward, these advanced systems like automotive automation, V2X, drone delivery systems, private 5G, and augmented reality, these all require ultra-low latency connections from these OTN devices into the telco infrastructure at the far edge. And at the far edge, you can host these applications that enable these types of new revenue streams for the service provider. However, none of that's going to happen if there isn't an open architecture and open software implementation all the way to the edge of the service provider network. So we see, in summary, those real two huge benefits. One, you have this fundamental change in the commercial paradigm and operational and lower TCO associated with using open architectures and open software, but also an enablement for new revenue streams where the service provider is not single-sourced and hamstrung to the legacy telco equipment manufacturers and has the freedom and flexibility, as you mentioned, to make those choices and build revenue on that new architecture.
Great, thanks for those examples, Paul. And Beth, Do you feel the same way about the benefits that open infrastructure brings? Any additional views?
I think a lot of what Paul said was correct, but I'd like to drill down on sort of the disaggregation of the hardware and the software, because I think that's the real benefit that this open architectures really takes. Traditionally, proprietary systems have been sort of the rule of the day, but that hasn't been true for a few years. And, from the telco perspective, being able to, change that software and change those services very quickly is extremely important. The reality is, building out a data center or building out a POP to support these new services, the hardware is going to be there for a while. It's expensive to set up, and it doesn't change that often. Every few years, or hopefully every 8 to 10 years. And so what we want to focus on is that making that hardware as generic as possible, so that we can quickly switch in new pieces of software, upgrades, new features, new applications to drive the demands of the market. But you are giving up some things when you do that, because the hardware, being generic, you're giving up that optimization that you got with the aggregated appliances. So, absolutely, the telcos have been moving toward that disaggregated market, but we are giving up, or disaggregated infrastructure, but we are giving up some optimization in the process. But of course, as hardware has gotten more powerful, that has mitigated some of that effect.
Thanks, Beth. It's interesting you mentioned the trade-off. It's a realistic view. There are benefits, but there is a trade-off at play here. Geoff, let me come across to you. Benefits that open infrastructure brings.
Yeah, we sit in a position of actually today running a fully open, very large-scale disaggregated network, probably the largest that exists currently in the market. I think the insight that we have, and I don't think we speak about this very much at all, the key benefit of open interfaces is what Franz touched on, it's accessibility. We're in the business of running fleets of devices, fleets of nodes. We have 50,000 outdoor base stations. We have 300,000 cells that radiate from femto to indoor to those outdoor to provide that complete coverage. But because they are all open and accessible, we manage them as one fleet of radio devices. And that allows us to optimize and run a system, not vendor islands. And the benefits then in terms of speed of deployment, speed of rollout, speed of upgrade, speed of management, all come from the fact of the accessible interfaces. Now, we've even gone to the step of converting proprietary CPRI interfaces to eCPRI interfaces, so we can maintain that one control plane and that one management plane. So interestingly, I think it always surprises me that people think that open networks somehow deliver an answer. I don't think that's true at all. I think open networks deliver the opportunity to create an answer because they are open.
Yeah, thanks very much, Geoff. It's more of a tool then. It's a means to a resolution there. Great. John, let me come across to you next for additional insights into this.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So, as I said earlier, our focus is very much on the underlying infrastructure, the sort of pulling together some of the glue behind the networks that people were talking about earlier. And within their open networking, we really see it's about faster innovation, more choice, and improved economics. And if you think about how the optical networking industry evolves, we build faster and faster optical networks that are getting progressively more complicated and more expensive to develop. So you end up with a smaller number of vendors who've got deep enough pockets to be able to do the innovation. So if you look at the current generation, it's 800 gigs. There's only a small number of vendors that do 800 gig technology today. There were a larger number doing 400 before that, and 600 in between, and there's a bunch of vendors now working on greater than 800 gig technology. But we all come to market at slightly different times. We all have strengths and weaknesses. Every vendor believes they're the best on the planet, but everyone has strengths and weaknesses, and that means we come to market at different times. It means we can bring innovation at different times to our customer base. And the idea of open networking really enables that raw infrastructure that connects all these base stations and all these data centers that the rest of the panelists have been talking about, enables us to connect them, as I say, faster innovation with much better economics. And that real breaking down of that closed environment into an open optical networking infrastructure is a key enabler, really. And one of the really good example is the current challenges we have with the supply chain. If you think of we're in the optics world, but a lot of the components in our devices are silicon and chips, and we have the same challenges that a lot of the rest of the industry has. And lead times at the moment are really quite long. So if you have the ability to look at other vendors and basically drop in a wavelength from vendor B into a network that's built by vendor A, it can enable you to sort of move quicker to higher speeds, get that better economics, bring new functionality into the optical network that then underpins the rest of everything else we're talking about here with data centers and radio networks, for example.
Oh, that's very interesting, John. Yeah, thanks for those insights. Franz, did you want to come in and comment on this?
Very many valid things and true things have been said already, so I don't want to repeat that. Just one or 2 points to mention here. So I very much like this freedom of choice and the option to select what you do, and that comes nicely together because you also can exchange certain parts. If, for example, supply chain with one of your partners is an issue, open enables you to find workarounds because it's open, and you just exchange that. Of course, just is not super easy, but you exchange that piece of the puzzle, or you find an additional solution you bring in parallel to the existing one, so you can overcome that challenge, and you can much easier work with that. But you also, in an open infrastructure, you can add new things much easier because you don't need to wait for your favorite current partner until he has a certain solution. If there are some other solutions out there which are faster, and you feel confident, you can much easier add that to your service portfolio, and that way also be faster for your customer. Another aspect, I think, which hasn't been touched that much yet, openness, of course, does not stop inside our network, but what we also need to think about, and that's currently ongoing, how we open up our networks themselves to be consumed by a higher layer service, so to say. So really that we provide openness to access our network and to enable customers to provide solutions that they can integrate our networks and our capabilities easier in their end-to-end environment. That's also an aspect of openness, which I see going on, and which will change the game quite a bit going forward.
Yeah, absolutely, Franz. That is another important aspect of this whole conversation. Geoff, let me quickly come back to you for a follow-up point.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on what John was saying and give a really practical example to put it into context. I mean, we run a massive optical network inside Japan. Let's say that we're using it, we use John's products. For us to be able to provision that optical network to support our services, we have to have access to John's products to program it into our operational systems. Now, if John's products are completely closed, then John turns around and says, well, you can have my management console, and we sell them both together. Then what that means is that we're employing a team of people to actually look after that equipment, and we're doing it manually with phone calls or whatever. The next step is that John turns around and says, well, we'll open up that interface. You don't have to buy our management system. Here are our own APIs. What that means to us, and we have done this, like I said, is it's very common in software today, we build a shim that makes John's equipment look exactly like everybody else's equipment. And then ideally, the industry drives us to somewhere that says, well, actually, the whole of the optical industry has agreed that this is how we should be able to provision, commission, decommission, provision, unprovision different optical capacity. And then, of course, we can accelerate faster using that openness. Now, John's benefit is that John becomes immediately more attractive to us if he removes those first 2 or 3 steps. And I think that's the true power of an open system versus a closed system. And you get that choice again.
Geoff, that's a really useful real-world example there. Thanks for that. So, how do we go about all this? How do we build, develop, and utilize this open ecosystem? Now, I appreciate that we could be talking for hours and hours and hours about how we actually go about this. But so, without getting into the weeds too much, how do we? Is there a best practice way of going about this? Beth, from your perspective, what do you recommend?
So there's sort of 2 aspects to that. There's, we need to, as telecoms and vendors, we need to work together. And the mechanism to do that is, of course, the open source community. And I'll just point out, there's a number of initiatives out there to develop those reference architectures and reference to support the open infrastructure that's needed. The one I'm working on currently is under the LF networking Anakit project, which has defined, it's been running for, about 4 years now. And it has a reference model, 2 reference architectures, one based on OpenStack and one based on containers, specifically Kubernetes. And then we have reference infrastructure, so implementations that you can test against. And we've developed something called Anakit Assured, which was launched last year, and we're hoping to gain traction with the telecom community. And the idea is that vendors and telecoms can use the Anakit Assured model to make sure that the infrastructure they're developing is, is in compliance with the models that we've defined. It actually gives everybody a lot more flexibility. And I think that's where it really needs to start. But it needs to be supported by both the vendors and the telecoms themselves. So the vendors and the operators need to work together in this open source community to drive these reference models and architectures forward. And Anakit is just one example because that's focused on the infrastructure. Obviously, the Open Infrastructure Foundation, has its entire purpose is to support open cloud infrastructures. It's very heavily influenced by the telecom industry now, but there's also others that are developing APIs and other things. ORAN is another example I know we've referenced earlier. Which is a project to support open RAN architectures and open RAN standards. And all of this will benefit everybody in the end. It lowers costs, it increases efficiency, increases flexibility. And I'm a big believer of it.
You certainly are, Beth, and sterling work that you and all your colleagues do in this area. And as you say, it comes down to community. We've all got to get involved. All aspects of telecoms has to get involved. Sandro, let's come across to you for some views on how we go about all this.
Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree with what Beth pointed out. So the creation of the community and actually the active participation of vendors and telecom operators and basically all of the players that are going to be in this new open ecosystem of telecom is absolutely important, right? I think that another aspect that we really need to look into is that besides like the definition of open standards, the integration work that we have going on, we really have to look into how we make these solutions more easily consumable as well, right? And I mean that by trying to address really the full array of companies that could be benefiting out of these solutions beyond like the major operators in the world, but also, other companies that can be utilizing, like, for example, RAN solutions, core solutions, and basically everything telecom related, right? So it is important that there is work being done jointly on the vendor side, on the operator side as well, to establish ways for the outcome of all of these open standards, all of these discussions actually becomes easily consumable. And that could be via the publication of reference architectures, and even in some cases like the availability of pre-integrated foundational solutions that allow vendors and service providers and operators to actually build their networks on top of that. So it is a process that, in the same way that happened, like, for example, with the mainframe industry decades ago, where you move from the mainframe to the fully disaggregated solutions and then back to kind of these hyper-converged solutions that we see in the IT world. At the end of the day, you may get up, without losing sight of the openness, you may get to a point where there is a movement of consolidation that would allow basically the open solutions, the open foundation of these networks to become more easily consumable.
Thanks very much, Sandro. As you say, we certainly don't want to be putting up any barriers to wider adoption. Paul, let's come across to you next.
Thanks, Guy. I think as I listen to Beth and Sandro talk, I want to pull out a key point that they're both making. In a way, the significant challenge here is actually around ecosystem. And that's a key point here. When you look at the disaggregation of these network elements, and certainly service providers are experts in integrating in their network all these different vendors and their solutions to provide an end service to their customers. However, as we vertically and now horizontally disaggregate these software and hardware components, we are adding a level of complexity to deploy and manage and integrate these systems. And with that complexity, if that really lands on the service provider as a burden for them to manage, it will slow the adoption of open technology systems for these different applications. And that's a negative effect. We don't want to see that happen. So the mention of ecosystem and the partnership that has to happen outside of the telco between the vendors as we integrate solutions better, that has the natural result of reducing friction to adopt these new open technologies. An example that we've done with Dell recently is the Dell Wind River infrastructure block, where we've taken the bare metal layer along with Dell's bare metal orchestrator and our orchestration and automation functions in Kubernetes-based cloud technology, and fully integrated that. It still complies with a fully open architecture with open APIs, but presents a commercial offer that allows a service provider to adopt it and deploy it with lower friction, thereby enabling an easier adoption of these new open technologies. So I do think net it's really important to look at the ecosystem and have partnerships between the vendors where we attempt to reduce the friction and costs for the service provider to adopt these open solutions.
Yes, thanks, Paul. We certainly don't want to add any extra complexity. Geoff, let's go across to you for some additional thoughts.
Yeah, it's and maybe we'll put the cat among the pigeons a little bit here. I never meet an internet company that worries about these things. I meet loads of internet companies that are solving a business problem to grow, and then they solve these things. And I'd never meet internet companies that worry whether they're solving these things the same way as other companies are solving them. Now, another observation is that the one company that's done all of these things is Rakuten, and it's an internet company. And I get asked this question continuously. It's like, how did you know this was ready when we first started in 2018? The answer is, it's not ready. And it's never ready because technology is never done. But we have to start. And then what becomes very interesting is that people coalesce around best practice solutions. And the help in standardizing those is really valuable. But to wait for collaboration and common solutions, I think somehow in telecom we're missing the point. It comes back to Paul's comment earlier that there are two parts to this conversation. There's one that makes us run our business better, And then there's a bigger problem this industry has, is that we've got to offer competitive services for other people to be able to take advantage of what we deliver. It used to be voice, it's not voice anymore. So both of those elements, I think, have a sense of urgency. Telecom isn't competing against telecom anymore. Telecom is competing against the next generation of digital service provider, cloud company, anybody that understands how to put software together and deliver solutions. So I hope that the telecom industry has a sense of urgency to actually discover a business mindset rather than a agreement technology mindset.
Yeah, thanks, Geoff. Good points. And also, I think you've just written the brief for one of the DSP Leaders World Forum sessions for next year. I think that's an area we really have to focus more on. So thanks for that. Sandro, I think you wanted to come back with an extra comment.
At the end of the day, this is also about enabling time to market, time to value, right? So on both comments, like from Paul and Geoff, right? So yeah, it's about making sure that, yes, I mean, we're discussing on open standards, we're developing these solutions, we are disaggregating the stack, but we have to make sure that we make these solutions available and easy to consume across the board. So not only for the big companies, the big operators that have huge engineering departments, but also by other operators in the world, and even enterprises that may be using these solutions in private environments as well. So this is kind of where the industry has to find a sweet spot. Let's put it like that. So yes, we need to disaggregate the stack. We need to open the standards, but at the same time, we need to manage complexity and be pragmatic so we don't impact negatively the time to market, time to value of these solutions. And I believe that's the good news, is that this is where the industry is going to, right? So.
Thanks very much, Sandro. I hope so. Beth, over to you for an additional comment.
Yeah, just wanted one final comment. I think absolutely the telecoms are seeing a business model where we're competing against a different set of players. You're right, we don't necessarily compete against each other, although I would question whether we're competing against the cloud providers. But really what we're doing is, it's not voice anymore. It's getting people's applications and data to where it needs to go. And, we want to be as cost effective about building that infrastructure that supports that as much as possible. And, as much as we can have the vendors work with us to make it more cost effective, the more power. And the more power for everybody. And again, I think the open community really can help in driving that forward.
Great, thank you, Beth. Well, we're almost out of time, but I do want to quickly squeeze in an extra question because I'd really like to ask whether or not we need some kind of framework for all this, some kind of support framework to make all this work. And if so, who takes the lead? Or is it left to individual companies, associations and communities to fulfill this function? John, let me come across to you for some thoughts here.
Yeah, thanks, Guy. Yeah, I think the way we see it from the optical networking perspective is that to some extent you've got to let different layers of the network run at their own speed. There's been there's different challenges in different parts of the network. Geoff just gave some very good examples about the internet and the ICPs. That part of the industry has been very open for quite some time. They also have a different set of challenges to the communication service providers in terms of raw infrastructure and legacy systems and the breadth of traffic they're trying to carry over their networks. But they've moved very fast in that way. And what we've seen is that over the years, there's been a large number of industry bodies and open bodies that have come and gone. And the ones that tend to be successful are those that have a good set of membership from both the vendor community, but also from the network operator community. So, organizations like TIP are doing very well at the moment, Open Rodem, newer organizations like the OpenXR Forum, all of which have that sort of really good mix of the people building the equipment and the people who are planning on rolling it out and building networks using that equipment. And once you get that mix, that tends to work very well. That tends to then drive the standardization you need to do what Geoff described earlier about the open interfaces. We need the Yang modeling, the NetConf interfaces, such that we can present an open API from the optical layer and let any network operator kind of do what they want with it. It's just as a manageable set of bandwidth that at the end of the day is all lasers and physics and complicated electronics, but you need to disaggregate it and open it up, and that really comes from having that good mix, I think, of the right people being involved in the right bodies. And at the moment, I'd say we've got some good bodies involved in opening up the parts of the network that we're involved in, the organizations we see. I'm sure there's other examples. ORAN seems to be doing some good work on the RAN side of things, which is a little bit away from where we are, perhaps, although we do obviously provide the underlying infrastructure in mobile networks as well. But yeah, I think it's going well where you get that good mix. And I think that's where you need to let those organizations run. I think if you try to have some even bigger overseeing body that tries to organize everything, I think you're just creating such a complicated problem that I think at the end of the day, the operators will work out the way to move different parts of their network at the right speed to an open infrastructure when it works for them and when it brings them benefits in terms of the things we talked about before about speed, innovation, and economics.
Yeah, thank you very much, John, for that. Well, let's talk to one of our operators now, Franz. Do you think that's the case? Are you happy with the way things are with the smaller individual associations and communities really looking after this?
It's a starting point. Look, if you want to be able to build a network out of many components, and you don't want to have all the components come together for the first time ever in your lab, you need to provide opportunities in the ecosystem, in the community, so that different players can come together, certify, test. Plugfest is a very well established concept here. In the Oran area, where I'm pretty much engaged, we have this kind of community labs where we really try to put out a reference architecture so that new players can connect to it, test their own stuff, work on the interfaces, have some real world testing, figure out where you need to still work on specs. So an open infrastructure only can be realized if the community comes together and if you give opportunity to the community to work. And as Oran Otik has said, or Tip, I think this is exactly the approach to go and running these kind of plugfests and make open infrastructure accessible also for new players to test against, to work against, to make their solutions visible, so that if you take solutions that may have some badges or certifications or whatever will come out here, if you put them together, you may not be in a plug and play situation, but it works, and you spend your time, your expensive time in your own operator's lab to fine tune, to adapt to your specific deployment case, but not start at stage 0 and go through all these painful exercises to get the thing up and running in the first place. So community is key.
Yeah, thanks, Franz. Good insights there. Sandro.
I fully agree with what John and Franz said. And, the standardization bodies, the open initiatives, the communities, they are great. They establish kind of the necessary framework for us to succeed in opening up the stack and deploying and bringing all of these open solutions to reality. But of course, that is not enough, right? So I believe that the role of the vendors in actually rolling up their sleeves and working with each other, establishing partnerships to actually execute upon these standards is absolutely important. I think like the example that Paul brought with the cooperation that we have with River now for the infrastructure blocks is a great example of two companies that got together and rolled up their sleeves to get stuff done, right? So yeah, the standardization, the framework is extremely important, but as a community, as an ecosystem, we really have to roll up our sleeves and work on the execution and make these a reality. And well, mine are already rolled up, as you can see, so waiting for the others.
Thanks, Sandro. Always working. That's great. And Paul, quickly across to you.
Yes, I feel bad my sleeves aren't rolled up. I guess what I'd say on this topic is there's a delicate balance, right? In that you obviously want these communities and open source activities and even standards organizations creating a framework through which largely interoperability and compatibility is created. The delicate balance point, though, is there can be a tipping point where it stifles innovation or creates waste. A lot of what we're looking at today around this open architecture fundamentally is a software-defined network architecture. Software and automation and AI and things like that are coming pervasively throughout the network. And that really means the cloudification of the network from the core to the edge, and the use of next generation software methodologies in there, like CI/CD deployment of applications and lifecycle management, or AI single pane of glass management and predictive outage avoidance. These type of things are very cutting edge. Now, we saw some of this happen with Etsy and NFV back in the day, if I might point to the past, where things like service chaining and complex architectures were being envisioned that the industry gyrated over, kind of ignoring the fact that the software community had centered around OpenStack as the way that these things would be done. And that creates some conflict and can stifle innovation. So we have to be careful about that we don't allow a single overarching framework to exist, that we do behave properly in an open community, an open source community, and drive that innovation so that the service providers can take the best benefits of this new software-defined world into their networks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul. And Beth, I think you might have our last word today.
Wow, I'm honored. So what I'd like to say is, I agree with what everybody's been saying. I think it's all a start, but I think the biggest problem is resources. I'm a member of the open source community, several of them. I'm stretched very thin because, as I like to say, sometimes I have a real job too, that Verizon pays me to do. And what I find is that many of the same people show up within these open source and standards bodies, from the companies. So, there's one person or maybe two or three people from Nokia, or one or two or three people from Dell, and they keep reappearing. And I don't think that's a good way to get the message out, to get the resources that we need to move these projects forward. So the companies need to put the resources in, because they need to understand that they're going to get great value out from contributing more to these projects. And I think that's particularly in recent years, has become a significant problem and a bottleneck to moving forward. And possibly, as Paul says, possibly stifling some innovation in the process.
Great, thanks very much, Beth. And we must end our program there, unfortunately, because we are way over time. But it's been such a fantastic discussion. We will pick up any loose threads during our live Q&A show. Thank you all very much for taking part today. Really appreciate you sharing all your views. Now, if you're watching this on day one of our Open Telco Infra Summit, then please do send us your questions. I'm sure you've got a lot of them based on what we've just heard. We'll answer as many of them as we can in our live Q&A show that's later today. And don't forget to view the other discussions and keynote interviews we have in this year's summit. They'll all be available soon on demand. For now, though, thanks for watching and goodbye.